Welcome back to MCB 170, Society and the Brain. This is Lecture 14, which corresponds to Part 2 of Module 7. The title of Module 7 is Becoming Us. In Module 7, we're discussing brain development. In Part 1, we focused on the development of the visual system because it is the best understood. In Part 2, we'll be discussing other abilities, like language ability and the ability to make moral and ethical decisions. In all these cases, it's important to point out that the development of a new function follows changes in the anatomical structure of the brain, changes in the connections of neurons with each other. We discussed this already in the context of vision in Part 1, where we looked at the projection from the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus to the visual cortex, primary visual cortex. And we saw the importance of the organization of those connections in visual cortex for the development of visual perception. Here we'll see also that functions like social ability, language development, moral reasoning require anatomical, structural, and functional development in the brain. We know about this partly through studies done on rodents. In experiments where young rodents were separated from their mothers, from their families, from their group at an early age. And the consequences on brain structure were examined later. Maternal separation of rat pups results in reduced connectivity within and between limbic structures, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, the central nucleus of the amygdala, and the medial prefrontal cortex. Isolation from conspecifics. Conspecifics are animals of the same species. So isolation from the group causes anatomical and physiological abnormalities in the hippocampus in male guinea pigs and to a lesser extent in female guinea pigs. These are all critical limbic structure areas. Here again is a diagram of the limbic system showing amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus. The bed nucleus of the stria terminalis is either a hypothalamic nucleus or related to hypothalamic nuclei. The prefrontal cortex will be about here. It's not indicated in this slide. All of these parts of the brain, in or related to the limbic system, are important for the processing of emotion and for social interactions. Many of these parts of the brain do not develop normally in animals who are separated from their group, animals of their same species. Experiments in which primates have been separated from their group are not as common, and in fact, they would be considered cruel and couldn't be done anymore. But they were done back in the 60s and 70s, famously by Harry Harlow, a famous psychologist. He showed that primates need social contact in order to develop normally. He did these famous experiments with terry cloth mannequins and found that baby monkeys will cling to a terry cloth mannequin if deprived of their mothers. Monkeys raised in isolation from their mothers for 6 months or more show severe deficits in social behavior. So on the behavioral level, monkeys separated from their mothers do not develop normal social ability. This can be partially restored after isolation through exposure to younger monkeys. It's very interesting that if you deprive a monkey of a developmental stage by removing it from its mother and from its troop, the monkey can kind of learn that social behavior if it interacts with younger animals who are at that developmental stage. But if the monkey doesn't have that ability to make up for lost time, it will never develop normal social ability as an adult. Fortunately, experiments where human children were isolated from society, have not been done by modern science, to my knowledge. But there are reported cases of children who were raised either in isolation or in the wild, in the woods by a troop of wolves. I'm not sure if those stories are true or not. They might be apocryphal. But there are cases where children are raised in isolation or with animals, usually dogs, and the consequences of that on their behavior have been studied. Before we discuss those consequences, let's just think about what makes us human. What distinguishes us from other animals? Well, you might say it's the ability to make moral and ethical decisions, and it is. You might also say it's language ability. The ability to express any idea in words is a quintessentially human capability. But even lower than that, you might say that what distinguishes humans, say, from other mammals is the ability to walk on 2 feet and to stand upright. All of these things do distinguish us from other animals, especially other mammals. None of those develop normally in a child who's raised in isolation from human beings. Here's an interesting case of a girl reported to have been raised by dogs in Siberia. If you look more closely at this case in this interesting book by Newton, you see that she wasn't raised by dogs, but she was raised with dogs. They stuck her in a barn with a bunch of dogs, and food and water were provided for the dogs that she ate and drank to stay alive. She never developed normal language capability. She would sort of bark and snarl and growl, but she did not learn how to talk. A human being cannot spontaneously learn language in isolation from other human beings. Interestingly, this girl also failed to develop normal gait. Gait is walking, human walking. She did not develop the ability to walk normally. Worse than that, she failed to acquire upright posture. This girl couldn't even stand up on her 2 feet. So we see that not only language, but also walking and just standing up straight requires social interaction. In this regard, it's remarkable how readily adults will help children learn to stand up and walk. We seem to do this naturally. We seem to do this automatically. And this act, helping children stand up and walk, is usually accompanied by great joy. We know about language acquisition also from studies done on children who were raised in isolation. This is a famous case of a girl named Jeannie, who was kept in isolation by her father and discovered at the age of 13. She grew up in a room by herself from birth until she was 13 years old. Jeannie never acquired proper syntax. What's syntax? Well, there are two aspects of language, semantics and syntax. Semantics are words and their meaning. Syntax refers to grammar, the rules by which we put words together into meaningful sentences. Jeannie never acquired proper syntax. After she was discovered, she could learn vocabulary. They could teach her new words, new names for things, but she never learned how to properly put those words together into meaningful sentences. This is profound because so much of our thought processes occur through words. We can think higher things because we can put words together into complex sentences. Jeannie never developed the ability to do that because she was raised in isolation as a child. Jeannie and other cases and other experiments show that deprivation causes a failure of development during a critical period of the intra and intrahemispheric connections that are needed for language. So in part one, we talked about a critical period for the development of visual perception. It's also true that in human beings, there's a critical period for the development of language. If a human being doesn't learn grammar during that critical period, that human being will never learn to produce grammatically correct speech. Again, it's remarkable how readily older people will interact verbally with younger people, talking to them, engaging them, reading with them. Again, this is an act that happens spontaneously, happens naturally, happens automatically, and it's usually accompanied by a considerable amount of happiness and joy. So as I mentioned, the acquisition of all these abilities follows structural changes in the brain, anatomical changes in the brain. Anatomical changes in the brain occur from childhood to young adulthood. By young adulthood, I mean mid-20s to late 20s. There are still anatomical changes occurring in the brains of human beings until their late 20s. There are anatomical changes occurring in the brains of most of the students taking this course. These changes involve both white and gray matter. White matter, recall, are axons, axon bundles. Axons typically are covered with myelin. Myelin is basically composed of fat cells that insulate axons and allows them to conduct faster. So white matter are nerves, bunches of axons covered with myelin that appear white in gross brain tissue. So it's called white matter. The gray matter is everything else: cell bodies, dendrites, axon terminals, and synapses. All of that is gray matter. Anatomical changes involving white matter and gray matter as we proceed from childhood through young adulthood are very different. Gray matter exhibits a wave of augmentation followed by diminution as neural processes and synapses grow out and are pruned back again. So gray matter gets less as you move from childhood into young adulthood. In contrast, white matter volume and density, reflecting increased myelination, continues to increase until well into young adulthood, like age 27 or 28. The loss of gray matter is seen as fine-tuning, while the gain of white matter is seen as strengthening of relevant connections within and between brain regions. All of this allows our brains to operate more effectively and more efficiently. This diagram shows changes in brain matter. Here's a human brain, front of the brain, back of the brain, temporal lobe, central sulcus. You can see that in almost all of these parts of the brain, the amount of gray matter is decreasing, and it's occurring over a long period of time. These scales are in steps of 5 or 10 years, from 0 to 25 or 30 years, until well into your adulthood, your early adulthood. Your gray matter, mostly dendrites, synapses, are decreasing. They're diminishing as your brain fine-tunes its processing. White matter, on the other hand, continues to increase in various parts of the brain, connecting various parts of the brain together to make communication between them faster and more efficient. This slide is it's superimposed on an MRI scan showing structure, and this just indicates parts of the brain that, on average, fiber tracts that tend to grow during the developmental process. The different abilities develop at different times, and the progression and development of brain structures takes the following course. 1. Regions observing lower level functions, such as primary sensory and motor cortices, mature first. We talked about development of the primary visual cortex in part 1. 2. Regions observing basic language skills and spatial attention, such as the temporal and parietal association cortices, mature next. And 3. Regions observing the higher order associations involved in sensory motor integration and attentional modulation, such as the prefrontal cortex, mature last. It seems that bottom-up pathways develop first, and the top-down pathways involved in control develop later. Okay, what do I mean by bottom-up and top-down? Bottom up generally goes from the world to the sensors up to the brain, and top down goes from the brain back out, usually to the motor system. But here's a very interesting interaction. In part one, we talked about the visual system. The primary pathway is from the retina to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, to the primary visual cortex, and from primary visual cortex up to higher areas of the visual system. And we focused on the projection going up, bottom up, from the lateral geniculate nucleus to the visual cortex. Here's a very interesting fact. There's also a projection that goes from the visual cortex back to the lateral geniculate nucleus. In fact, there are 10 times more fibers going from visual cortex back to lateral geniculate nucleus as go up from lateral geniculate nucleus to visual cortex. Why is that? Why is there that huge backward projection? It's probably for control. And it's probably, among other things, it probably allows you to focus your visual attention on a particular important item in the visual field and ignore extraneous items in the visual field. Here's a diagram I like to show of the human brain. Here's the front of the brain, back of the brain, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. And it shows the primary and higher order cortices. In dark shades, you can see the primary cortices. Primary visual cortex, we discussed this at length in part 1 of Module 7. Similarly, we have a primary auditory cortex and a primary somatosensory cortex. These are the parts of the brain that are responding to very simple stimuli, basic stimulus features, from which the more complex ones are built up from. So you start with elongated blobs in primary visual cortex, then you go to corners, then simple shapes, complex shapes, and then really complicated shapes like faces. Similarly, for the auditory cortex, you would go from simple perception of tones to more complex combinations of inputs like words, which would be perceived in Wernicke's area. Similarly, we have primary motor cortex. Recall that the central sulcus kind of divides the brain in half, where behind the central sulcus you have mostly perceptual, and in front you have mostly motor and planning. Right in front of the central sulcus, we have the primary motor cortex, which is going to control simple movements. Around here, we'd have Broca's area, which is going to encode more complicated movements, like the coordinated movements required for pronouncing a word or for putting words together into a sentence. Broca's area is then going to drive primary motor cortex to break that command down into simpler movements, which will then actually drive the mouth and the tongue and the jaw in producing intelligible speech sounds. So the primary cortices develop first. Then the association cortices, which pull sensory systems together, develop next. And last are attentional mechanisms, attentional control mechanisms, largely in the prefrontal cortex, that control our behavior, that filter out unwanted inputs, and that allow us to behave according to our plans. Let's demonstrate attentional modulation. Fixate on this spot. Just focus on that green spot. Who appeared in the upper left-hand corner? Was it Lenny Kravitz? Here's another test. On the next slide will be some letters, all of the same color. When you see them, answer fast. What color are the letters? What you saw was the word green written out in red letters. The letters were red, the word spelled green. Much of the function of the maturing frontal cortex, especially including prefrontal cortex, is described as filtering out unwanted sensory input and of suppressing unwanted motor responses. The ability of a human in performing this control continues to develop over the first 2 decades of life. and susceptibility to interference from competing sources lessens with maturity. So the first 2 decades of life means from birth until about 20 years old, late teens, early 20s. Most of you are pretty good now at attentional control. You're good at filtering out unwanted sensory input and of suppressing unwanted motor responses. So maybe most of you didn't know that Lenny Kravitz appeared in the upper left-hand corner, or you said red rather than green when I flashed the word green written out in red letters. If you failed at those tasks, then you're going to be more like me. I've always had trouble in those kinds of tasks. These kinds of abilities, attentional control, are studied in the lab using tasks such as the Stroop test. The Stroop test was the word green written out in red letters that we just demonstrated. The go, no-go task, the saccade suppression, and the anti-saccade task. The saccade suppression task we illustrated with the green dot and Lenny Kravitz example. A saccade is a rapid eye movement. In the saccade suppression task, you're supposed to fixate on a green spot and not look at a distractor somewhere else in the visual field. The anti-saccade task is even more complicated. In the anti-saccade task, you're fixating on a central spot, some item flashes up in the periphery, and you're supposed to not only ignore the item that flashes up in the periphery, but make a saccade, a fast eye movement, in the opposite direction. So if you're fixating the green spot and Lenny Kravitz appears in the upper left-hand corner, you're supposed to ignore Lenny Kravitz and make a fast eye movement to the lower right-hand corner of the visual scene. The go, no-go task involves a go and a stop signal and some action. In the simplest case, there's a green light and a red light, and when the green light flashes, the subject has to press a button. When the red light flashes, the subject should not press the button. I always fail at this task. The green light flashes and I press the button, and after a couple of those, I'm already not paying attention. My mind is wandering somewhere, and the red light comes on and I press the button anyway. As humans mature and get better at these tasks, activity and task-relevant parts of the cortex, mainly frontal and parietal, become more focal and fine-tuned, while activity decreases in regions not involved in the task. This is really interesting, because we know, maybe paradoxically, that as the brain matures, dendrites and synapses actually get fewer, not more. But that allows the brain to fine-tune itself. Fine-tuning of connections makes the brain more efficient. It actually decreases the overall activity level of the brain. It makes the brain operate in a more effective and more efficient manner. This is described very nicely in this article by Casey, 2005, which is your reading for the week. So let's look at some of the data. Here we have errors on some of these tasks as a function of age. Here you see suppression of reflexive saccades in a couple of different studies. This would be like the green dot and Lenny Kravitz example that we showed. Here are some anti-saccade examples, looking in the direction opposite Lenny Kravitz. Here's a Stroop test, which we also demonstrated with the word green written out in red letters. Here's the stop signal reaction time, which is from the go, no-go task. And what you see in all these cases is that the errors decrease. Errors on these tasks decrease as young people are getting older. And here you see that performance is pretty good in the late teens, early 20s, where most of you are at. So most of you are probably pretty good at those tasks. Here for comparison, you can see improvement in certain other kinds of abilities. Here, verbal fluency, semantic, word meaning, and phonetic, word pronunciation, black and purple respectively, are gradually increasing in these age ranges. And nonverbal fluency, figures and designs in black and purple respectively, also increasing during this period. So as you're acquiring verbal fluency, ability to process nonverbal information, as those abilities increase, your ability to filter out unwanted sensory input and to control unwanted motor responses also increases, and your error on those tasks goes down. And all of this shows that your attentional modulation is improving. Your attentional control, your control of your automatic responses is improving. And we know from our previous discussions that the control of automatic responses kind of lies at the heart of moral and ethical behavior. So, are moral and ethical behavior also improving in this period in your life? Probably so. And we know this from studies done on human beings who sustain damage to their prefrontal cortex, either in young adulthood or as adults, or before that as children. This is a study done by Anderson and a group of neurologists who had access to these patients and were able to examine them. And they found that despite normal basic cognitive abilities, damage to the prefrontal cortex is associated with severely impaired social behavior, including insensitivity to future consequences of decisions, defective autonomic responses to punishment contingencies, and failure to respond to behavioral interventions. That sounds jargony. What does it mean? Insensitivity to future consequences of decisions means that individuals might know that a particular action could come out badly in the future, but they do it anyway. Defective autonomic responses to punishment contingencies is a case where someone informs a person that if they commit a particular violation, they're going to get punished. They don't care. Failure to respond to behavioral interventions means that you can't teach them. They're going to do the wrong thing, and there's nothing you can do to change that. Now, you might ask the question, why are these people behaving so badly? Is it because they know right from wrong and they just do wrong anyway? Or do they not even know right from wrong? Well, those two cases can be distinguished, and it depends on when the prefrontal cortex damage occurs. Unlike adult onset patients, however, adults who sustain prefrontal damage as children also have defective social and moral reasoning. So, if you're an adult and you sustain prefrontal cortex damage, you know right from wrong. You just might do wrong anyway. If you're a young person and you sustain prefrontal cortex damage, you never even learn right from wrong in the first place. That's profound. These results strongly suggest that the acquisition of complex social conventions and moral rules had been impaired by prefrontal cortex damage. So, there's a time in your life before you're an adult, or while you're becoming an adult, where you have to wire up your moral values and your ethical principles. If that doesn't happen, because you have prefrontal cortex damage, you're not going to develop the ability to make moral and ethical decisions. And there's another reason why you might fail to develop that ability. We'll talk about that in a minute. First, let's point out that the early onset prefrontal damage resulted in a syndrome resembling psychopathy. What's psychopathy? Very generally, psychopathy is being out of touch with reality, not correctly perceiving the world. Characterized by a lack of empathy and remorse, shallow emotions, egocentricity, and deceptiveness. Psychopaths are highly prone to antisocial behavior and abusive treatment of others. They don't really seem to understand or care about the consequences of their actions, and they can do horrendous things to other people. Psychopaths are very disproportionately responsible for violent crime. Many of the individuals who commit mass murder, mass shootings, are psychopaths. Though lacking in empathy and emotional depth, they often manage to pass themselves off as normal people by feigning emotions and lying about their pasts, as portrayed beautifully in the movie Silence of the Lambs. This is the character Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins. He was very charming, and he could do horrendous things to other people. It's highly likely that psychopaths have some abnormality in their prefrontal cortex. Schizophrenia is a very serious mental disorder, probably due to abnormalities in the development of the prefrontal cortex, the frontal cortex in general and prefrontal cortex specifically. Schizophrenia can be a cause of psychopathy. Some, perhaps many schizophrenics do not process reality well. They can have cognitive deficits, and they can also have severe social deficits. It's very interesting that the onset of schizophrenia is from 15 to 35 years with a peak in young adulthood, right at the time when normally the brain is wiring itself up in order to make moral and ethical decisions. Schizophrenia seems to occur at the time when the brain is developing the ability to reason in a moral and ethical way. We know a lot about the normal development of moral reasoning by the work of the psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg. Kohlberg stressed the innate sense of justice as the essence of morality. You have an innate sense of justice? Yes, we actually do. We have an innate sense of justice, of equality, and of fairness. And we share this with our primate cousins. We'll talk about it later in the course. So we do have innate urges. We have automatic urges to actually be fair with each other and to make sure that everyone in the group gets treated more or less equally. We don't really like inequality on a fundamental level, on an automatic, innate emotional level. But there's more to morals and ethics than that, because really the heart of morality is self-control. It's controlling our behavior to make it conform with our moral values and ethical principles. So morality really is a combination of automatic and controlled processes. And it's basically control which enhances our innate urges to be fair and kind, and suppresses our innate urges to be competitive and aggressive. So Kohlberg also stressed that moral development is learned through social interaction and that it can be taught, that adults can teach children, and we can teach each other. It's beautiful to read these different stages. Kohlberg divided moral development into 3 levels, and each of the levels had 2 stages. Let's look at the very first and very last stage. The very first stage is called the punishment and avoidance stage, where a person makes moral decisions strictly on the basis of self-interest. They disobey rules if they can do so without getting caught. So the image brings to mind of a 3-year-old kid who's going to steal those cookies, if they can get away with it. At the highest level of Kohlberg's moral development, people adhere to a small number of abstract principles that transcend specific concrete rules, and they answer to a higher consciousness. How many people do you know like that? Maybe too few. And what part of the brain would you think is the most involved in this development? Compared with human subjects at lower levels of moral development, subjects at Kohlberg's highest level had more gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex. specifically in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and in the anterior cingulate cortex. Now, normally when I talk about the prefrontal cortex, I just call it the prefrontal cortex. I'm not really that concerned with subregions of the prefrontal cortex. In this case, I want to call your attention to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. When we talk about moral values and ethical principles, it does involve our whole prefrontal cortex, but it especially involves this part, the ventromedial. Medial means middle, lateral means to the side. Ventral means toward the stomach. Dorso would mean toward the back. So the ventromedial part of the prefrontal cortex is sort of toward the front and middle of the prefrontal cortex. The exact meaning, the exact location, I'm not concerned about, but you do want to remember that of all the prefrontal cortical regions, the one most closely associated with moral values and ethical principles is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And so we know from the studies that we've been discussing that moral reasoning depends on developmental processes that affect the prefrontal cortex. I think the whole prefrontal cortex, especially ventromedial prefrontal cortex. They also raise the possibility, I think the strong possibility, of a potentially long critical period for the acquisition of moral reasoning ability. By analogy with the development of visual and language ability, they also raise the possibility that a moral environment is needed for the normal development of moral reasoning ability. Just as we needed a visual environment for the normal development of visual perception, and we need a verbal environment for the development of language. We need a social environment for the development of social ability. We need a moral environment for the development of the ability to reason on a moral and ethical basis. And just as it's natural for humans to help kids learn how to stand and walk, and to help kids learn how to talk and read, and to kind of guide kids on how they should be, well, it's kind of natural for adults to teach kids moral values and ethical principles. It occurs in the family, it occurs at school, it occurs in, youth groups of various kinds. Later on, in adulthood, beyond age 30, the lifelong, we're still learning. We're still gaining knowledge and experience. And we're still teaching us how to be. We kind of teach each other in society how we should behave. So much of culture is about moral behavior, about right from wrong, about how people should relate to one another. So much of culture and so much of interaction really involves people instructing each other in moral and ethical behavior, gradually making the world a better and better place for everybody. I'll end there.